Okay, the one you've been waiting 2 weeks for. My apologies if you're following along with me in real time. This is the culmination of our study in Moses. I do want to tell you that while I appreciate you're watching the videos because for whatever reason you're not able to make it to youth group, you are missing out on the rich discussions. And for this lesson in particular, most of our lesson was discussion. Most of the best points were made by your friends and your peers. And so I do have the questions and I have some notes, but most of this lesson, it was really pivotal to be in class for this one. Okay, Moses was called a friend of God. What does it mean to be a friend of God? And then we discussed that. And the next point, we studied how God called Moses to deliver the Israelites from slavery in Exodus 3. Ultimately, God was the one doing the work. Moses's role was to God. He was to be an interpreter from God to the Israelites. He was to be a leader to the Israelites. He was supposed to be the mouthpiece specifically from God to Aaron, right? And then Aaron to the people. So what are the characteristics of a godly leader? We discussed that. We discussed what it looks like in different circumstances, different stages in our life, different ages. Does gender play a role? And if so, how? And then we moved from there into, are we working to build character into our life? It needs to be an intentional or it won't happen. And so we kind of talked about character. We also talked about virtue. And Cadence asked what virtue was, and I was so glad, because when I'm using a word that you guys don't know what it means, I want you to stop me right there and ask what it means. So we actually talked about virtue for about a good 15 minutes. There will be more lessons on virtue coming, but this was a really key discussion that we had. And so we want to talk about what does it take to intentionally follow Christ, to intentionally build character into our lives. Because if we want to be honest people, then we have to choose to tell the truth in those little situations. That's what's going to build integrity into our life. Oh, that was something else. Elliot brought up the definition of integrity, and we talked about what it means to be the same person when no one's watching versus when everyone's watching, right? Okay, so Moses interceded for Israel many times. In Exodus, when Israel was worshiping the golden calf while he was up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments, right? In Exodus 32, Moses asked God to relent from his wrath and spare the people. In Deuteronomy 5:5, Moses is again acting as that intermediary between God and Israel. And Zach reminded us that God's plan the whole time had been to make a nation of priests. Like, he was going to talk to all of the people, but when he did that from the mountain, they were so afraid that they told Moses to be their representative. Go ahead and you talk to God. We don't want to talk to him directly because it's too fearsome. And so then we talked about God's holiness and what that means and how terrifying it would be to be in the presence of God. We talked about Moses as lawyer and judge. In Exodus 20, verse 23, we see Moses receive the law from God and then teach the people diligently over and over. In Deuteronomy 4, 1-2, Moses exhorts the people to obey God. We may view this as him being like a pastor or a teacher, kind of that guiding and teaching role. Hebrews 11, 24-27. Now, Hebrews 11 is commonly called the Hall of Faith. So we talked about what a Hall of Fame is. We have some context for that. And so we talked about what the Hall of Faith was. There were some kids that had been familiar with it and read Hebrews 11 before, and some kids this was completely new to. And so that was a really good discussion as well. But Hebrews 11, 24-27 talks about Moses' faith. Numbers Chapter 12, verse 3 describes Moses as humble. So is it important for a leader to be humble? And through our discussion, we just decided that yes, it was, because you need to be listening to the people you're leading in order to lead them well. Moses' humility is reflected on his reliance on God. Moses didn't forget that it was God that was giving him the strength and the power to lead well. Moses showed endurance and perseverance by continuing to lead this often rebellious group. And so we talked about what does it mean to keep going when it feels like everything's against you. Moses' leading of the Israelites was not an easy task at all. He had to be patient. He had to be resilient. And so those were some of the things, and I hope to see you in class next week. Thanks for joining me.